It was a special morning for Dora. Mickey and Minnie Mouse were visiting her, and she decided to make a delicious pizza to welcome them. First, she had to make the bread dough. She had placed all the ingredients in her favourite bowl, and she was just giving them a stir. Once the dough was ready, she tipped it out onto her baking sheet and flattened it into a circular shape. Dora then went to the back of the kitchen to get her jug of tomato sauce. She tipped this onto her pizza dough. I love green peppers, she thought, so she selected one out of the fridge and put some slices on top of the tomato sauce. Well, a pizza wouldn't be right without any cheese, she thought, so she returned to the fridge and then arranged them over the peppers. Wow, this looks delicious, she said out loud, as she carefully placed her pizza into the oven to cook. Just then, the doorbell rang. I wonder who that could be, she questioned. It's too early for Mickey and Minnie, and she went to open the door. It was Pocoyo. Dora hadn't seen Pocoyo recently, so she invited him in, and they chatted for a little while. Dora, asked Pocoyo curiously, can you smell something burning? Oh no, cried Dora, the pizza! And she rushed to the oven, but it was too late. The pizza was burnt to a crisp. Dora was very sad. She told Pocoyo that she'd wanted to make a special treat for Mickey and Minnie Mouse. Don't worry, Dora, we can make another pizza, said Pocoyo. I'm afraid I have no ingredients left, sighed Dora. Well, let's go to the shop and buy some more, and I can help you, smiled Pocoyo. James will take us, I'm sure. So the two of them left the house and climbed aboard James, who happened to be waiting outside. They soon reached the shop and hurried inside. Look, Pocoyo, said Dora excitedly. They have tomatoes, cheese and even a pepper. Perfect! They put the items into the trolley and paid for them at the till. Dora and Pocoyo then carried the heavy shopping bag to James and climbed aboard once more. Back at the house, the two friends went straight to the kitchen to start cooking. They placed the ingredients onto the table and Pocoyo found a bowl and began to make the dough. Soon the dough was ready and was placed onto the baking sheet. Dora made a sauce using the tomatoes and then she arranged pieces of pepper and the cheese on top. What great teamwork, she smiled at Pocoyo. Thank you for helping me. The doorbell rang, and this time it was Mickey and Minnie waiting outside. Dora invited her guests inside. What a delicious smell, said Mickey. Dora smiled. I think the pizza's ready, she said, and she opened the oven. The pizza was cooked perfectly, and she sliced it into 4 pieces. This is the most delicious pizza I have ever tasted, said Minnie. Did it take you long to make? She asked. Well, slightly longer than we thought, said Dora, and they all chuckled.